Professor Karl Friston, it's wonderful to speak with you again. I think this is the 5th time that we've spoken on this channel. We've also spoken in person off air in London. That was beautiful to meet you. Where was it? The Royal Society?
It was the Royal Society. It was wonderful to see you.
Yes, it was wonderful. You said, meet me at, where did you say? It was some statue.
It was the
But I thought it was a pub.
Yes, I remember. It was the Duke of York steps.
Yes. You said, meet me at the Duke of York. And I looked online, Duke of York. Oh, that's a pub. Okay, it's 10 minutes away or 5 minutes away. And I'm running, and I think it was drizzling at that time. Yeah, anyhow, it was great. Great to see you. Why don't you start your presentation, sir?
Sure.
And just as context for the audience, this is for a lecture series on theories of everything called Rethinking the Foundations of Biology. What lies beyond Darwin is the question. In this episode, Karl Friston is just taking more of the rethinking the foundations of biology itself. So please.
Thank you. Indeed, I am. And for a reason. That reason is, I'm going to appeal here to Chris Fields, that there is no bright line between physics and biology, psychology, and one could even argue philosophy. So the foundations of biology should, by definition, therefore, be the foundations of physics and everything else. And I'm going to leverage the notion of everything else by just thinking about the nature of things, a foundation of thingness. The story I'm going to tell is a characterization of what it is to be something and the behaviors that that thing must possess. So this is a slightly deflationary foundational account of existence, in the sense it just describes those things that persist in time over a suitable timescale. The other aspect of this foundational account, I refer to it here as a physics of sentience. It's really just a physics of things that self-organize technically to a set of characteristic states or attracting states, an attracting set. The other aspect of this is that there's no new physics here. There's no new biology here. And there's probably no new psychology. It starts basically with the foundations that are shared by all of physics, ranging from quantum physics, quantum mechanics, through to stochastic and statistical mechanics, right through to classical mechanics. We're just going to start right at the beginning and ask the question, what is it to be a thing? And having answered that question. So the story here is what it is to be a thing and what characteristics must this kind of thing be. And I reiterate, the physics interpretation of this is not new, and it's actually almost tautological. The final point I want to make is I did notice that there was beyond Darwin. In many senses, the account that I'm going to briefly rehearse over the next few minutes is very closely allied with Darwinian thinking at two levels. First of all, it shares the same almost tautological aspect in the sense that we are just describing things that exist, and that existence is defined in terms of things that are there. The other point of contact is that what arises or emerges from this approach is a mechanics that you could say was the very mechanics of Darwinian selection. So I'm not going to go beyond Darwin. I'm going to meet Darwin and effectively tell a very, very similar story, but for using the language of mathematics and physics as opposed to the language of theoretical biology. What I'll do in the next few minutes is divide this discussion into three parts. First part is going to be just a consideration of the statistics of life, with a special focus on Markov blankets and the ensuing Bayesian mechanics. I'm then going to tell the same story, but using the rhetoric and concepts that a neurobiologist or a psychologist cognitive scientist might bring to the table, specifically unpacking the mechanics that has been established in the first bit in terms of predictive coding neural networks. And then if we've got time, sort of move to a consideration of different kinds of things, different kinds of particles, different kinds of people, different kinds of institutions, and draw a distinction between certain things that do not have an authentic kind of agency and other things that might have a natural intelligence or agency, and try and articulate that distinction in terms of, in fact, Markov blankets. Okay, so the first bit then. I'm going to start with a question posed by Schrodinger. How can the events in space and time which take place within the spatial boundary of a living organism be accounted for by physics and chemistry? Now, I'm not going to answer that question, but I am going to draw attention to the notion of a boundary. The boundary, I think, is essential in terms of individuating or distinguishing something from everything else, or indeed nothing or no thing. And I'm going to read that boundary as a statistical object, specifically a Markov boundary or Markov blanket. So what's a Markov blanket? Well, imagine we had a little universe where these cyan circles represent states and the arrows or the edges represent a causal influence. So this state influences this state. And if I identified some set of states, say my internal states, then the Markov blanket comprises the parents, the children, and the parents of the children. And the role that this set of states, this blanket, plays is that it separates me statistically from all the other states in the universe. If I wanted to know the dynamics of my internal states, given everything else in a putative universe, then I'd only need to know my blanket states. In other words, it provides a statistical veil or insulation that enshrouds my internal states and separates and individuates my internal states from my external states. Technically, it just means that the dynamics on the inside are conditionally independent of the dynamics on the outside, given the blanket states. I'm going to make a further move here. I'm going to introduce a bipartition of the blanket states into sensory states and active states, where the sensory states influence but are not influenced by the internal states, while the active states influence but are not influenced by the external states. So we've got this interesting but very simple partition of the states of any universe from my perspective in terms of blanket states comprising sensory and active states that, together with my internal states, could be regarded as the states of a particle. So it could be a small particle, it could be a person, or, as you've just intimated, an institution. It doesn't matter. The rules or the causal structure and the Markov blanket should apply in a scale invariant and possibly even scale-free sense. And just to provide you with a couple of examples of different scales, here's my favorite system, the brain, where we can regard the internal states of the brain as my neuronal dynamics, my connectivity, that influence the active states, that then change external states that could include my body, that in turn reciprocate by influencing the sensory states, my sensory epithelia, that then cause changes in my internal states.
And briefly, Professor, the difference between scale invariance and scale-free means what?
Technically, your renormalization group flow, or your RG flow, has some quantitative conservation as you move from scale to scale, as opposed to the functional form of the dynamics as described by the Lagrangian, or indeed the functional form of the equations of motion, just being conserved. So yeah, scale free, if you like, is a sort of special case of scale invariance, where there are extra constraints on what is conserved as you move from one scale to the next scale.
And also, just briefly, conditional independence for the Markov blanket is different than being completely independent.
Absolutely, and this is quite crucial. So clearly, if two sets of states were independent in the sense that they never influenced each other, you'd be describing two separate universes. And you would only be interested in focusing on one universe or the other universe. So you're only interested in terms of systems that or states that can be distinguished, individuated via conditional independences. So, if you like it, it's an open boundary. So, if you take yourself back to your schoolboy physics, what we're talking about now is what constitutes the heat bath in a sort of classical sort of physics view of, say, a canonical microensemble. We're interested is what's beyond the heat bath, and indeed, how do we communicate through a heat bath, which we can now treat as a Markov blanket, to what is beyond that. So we're talking specifically another way of foregrounding the importance of a Markov blanket is we're moving away from 20th century physics in the sense of equilibria into the world of non-equilibria that definitively require the system to be open. So where's the openness here? Well, the openness here is the openness of the system to the outside through a vicarious exchange with the outside, where if you like, the conditional independence is maintained by this two-way traffic. So the inside influences the outside through the sensory states, and the inside influences the outside through the active states. So the system is open, and therefore, when we're talking about self-organization of these open systems, we are effectively talking not about equilibria, we are talking about non-equilibrium steady states. And I'll illustrate one of those in the next slide, just to give a bit more intuition to this. So this is all about sort of self-organization of non-equilibria, far from equilibrium systems that are open, but open in a way that allows you still to preserve the difference between the thing, the internal states of the thing, and the states external or outside that kind of thing. And this is just another example here. Say a single cell organism with its intracellular states would be the internal states. The, say, actin filaments would be the active states that push the cell surface or the sensory states into the external milieu that reciprocates by changing cell surface receptors that changes the intracellular states. So just another example of the preservation of these conditional independences, and thereby the functional form of the dynamics, and thereby making this effectively apt for application of the apparatus of the renormalization group, which brings us back to the scale invariant aspect of this kind of partition.
So you said the filaments are the active states, but why do you call them active states and not an active part of the organism? What I mean to say is that, look, a state, I imagine, is the entire organism, but then you would say that this part is active. You don't call that an active state, at least just in the terminology that I'm familiar with.
Sure. So I'm using states here in the context of a state space. So an organism would be a collection of a very large number of states, so that the state of an organism would be a point in a high dimensional state space. So states here are collections of multiple different states, and this Markov blanket effectively is providing a partition of these multiple states in a particular way that allows you to distinguish. So you certainly could say that the active states, for example, could comprise a list of the particular position of all my actuators or my muscles. The reason I mention actin filaments is the actin filaments of cells are the things that sort of push the cell surface around. They actually cause movement. So normally speaking, your active states are simply those that afford the capacity to move. of the kind that you would expect to see, in biotic motion, for example.
Is that distinction quite clear, or is there some ambiguity between what's an active and an inactive state?
Right. Well, the definition of active states is only in relation to this Markov blanket partition. So you can label, the notion of an inactive state, introduces a different kind of semantics to it, which doesn't exist at this stage. So you can certainly have
Okay.
an active state or an internal state that is, for a certain period of time around an unstable point attractor, so it's not moving. So you could say, from a dynamical perspective, it's inactive because it's not changing. But at this stage, I'm just using the phrase active states just to denote a subset of ways of states in some state space that has this particular dependency relationship or influence relationship, and specifically here, the kind of states that influence the rate of change of external states. So this is explicitly a sort of dynamical formulation. It might actually be more intuitive if given this little diagram here. So this is a starting point for everything that follows, and in fact, let me ask you now to forget about the Markov blanket for a moment. What we'll do now is just do a 101 crash course in all of physics. And then what we're going to do is put the Markov blanket back into play and see what emerges. So this, in effect, is a reflection of what I was saying in the introduction, that the kind of physics that I'm going to describe here is no different from any other kind of physics, other than it is committed to a careful distinction between the states of something and the states of everything else that is not part of that thing, not a particular state, where the particular states include the Markov blanket states and the internal states. But if we just start where one could argue all of physics starts, including quantum mechanics, with a random differential equation or a description of a random dynamical system in terms of its motion, which is some lawful function of where it is in state space, plus a random fluctuation, then we can sort of cartoon this system. So I've just got two states here on the x and the y axes. And as the system develops, it just traces out a trajectory or a path in this two-dimensional state space. And again, appealing to this sort of scale invariant aspect, this can be any scale you want. So, for example, it could be electrochemical oscillations in a single cell in my body. It could be my cardiac cycle during a heartbeat, different aspects of the state of my heart. It could be me getting up in the morning, doing my emails, having a cup of coffee, and so on. Or it could be Christmas, Easter. The key thing is at any scale, or at any for any description of the universe at this scale in terms of some state space, the object in question here means that the system, I will keep revisiting at any scale states that I have once been in. So that's the kind of thing that I am trying to describe. Technically, a random dynamical system that possesses an attracting set or a limit set that itself is a random variable, namely a pullback attractor. So I'm interested in systems in which things can exist in virtue of there being this tendency to revisit states that you were once, or the system was once in. Is that clear?
Yeah, so anything that you do on repeat, whether it's your heart that has a beat or you're drinking a cup of coffee, either in the day or in multiple sips within the same 5-minute period. Now, what I don't get is, what is a pullback attractor compared to a regular attractor?
Well, a regular attractor, if one should exist, normally is read as an attracting or limit set for a deterministic system. But as soon as you introduce random fluctuations into the equations of motion or the dynamics, because this thing itself is a a random variable, the limit set is it again itself a random variable. Intuitively, you can think of winding back in time and then winding forwards again, given a particular realization of these random fluctuations to produce these pullback attractors. And I'm sure that doesn't help. What I often read is, for technical reasons, we refer to a pullback attractor. Uh, um, but I think in spirit, you can regard this just as um, an attractor in the vernacular sense. It's just a set of states that effectively the system looks as if it is attracted to, in virtue of the dynamics bringing you back to this manifold. But this manifold can be very, very space-filling and incorporate the itinerant dynamics that you were just referring to. So, that repetition, I think, is probably more crucial than one might realize when one first articulates it like that, because we're talking about things that will have, certain things that will have biotic aspects to them. So we're talking, for example, about things that have oscillations in them. And I, using the example of a single cell, electrochemical cell in my brain, I could regard this as a description of fast gamma oscillations, for example, in my hippocampus, of a cell in my hippocampus. But we can also read this tendency to revisit this particular kind of itinerancy that is associated with these pullback attractors as biorhythms. And you could even go as far as life cycles. And just to sort of bring you back to the title of your series, Beyond Darwin, replication is just another facet of the behaviors that these kinds of systems have to possess. So this is another, if you like, perspective on, we don't need to go beyond Darwin. Darwin had everything that was necessary. Just reproduction, replication is just one way this kind of itinerancy on a pullback attractor is manifest.
Interesting. Okay, let me see if I got that correct. In life, you reproduce or you replicate, and this replication you can see as an oscillation in the same way that you would drink the same cup of coffee multiple times.
Absolutely. I mean, what you've just described is a lovely illustration of the scale invariance of the mechanics at hand. And all you're saying is that there has to be an attracting set, and this attracting set is a set of states in a system that is open, and the openness comes along with the Markov-Planck Equation, which we'll get to in a second.
Sure, and I also assume that in the same way your heart doesn't beat the exact same way every single time, even though it looks identical to us with our eyes.
Yeah.
It has a slight variation. Maybe there is no such thing as two heartbeats in the same way. There's no such thing as two snowflakes that are exactly akin, that are exactly equivalent. They are akin.
Absolutely.
So I assume, and we don't have to get to the details, but I assume that in your model, it doesn't have to be exact repetitions. There can be some variation.
Absolutely.
Otherwise, you don't have Darwinianism.
Absolutely, yeah. And in fact, it can never be exact. You can never revisit. I should have said the neighborhood. So you revisit the neighborhood. And that is, if you like, the essence of this pullback attractor that inherits from these random fluctuations. So
okay,
you just
understood.
Yeah, you're revisiting regimes of state space that can be described probabilistically. So unlike a point attractor, a classical attractor, or indeed even Milnor attractors, we're not talking about being attracted to the same spot. We're talking about to the vicinity, in the neighborhood of. So this is where the probabilistic perspective comes in, because I can now interpret this pullback attractor as where the density of the trajectories that are never coincident, they never converge, they never cross. Well, perhaps they do cross, but we're probably getting into gauge theory now. But we can interpret the density of these trajectories, these paths, as a probability that you will find me in this state at any one particular time if you sampled me at a random time. So, exactly your observation that a man never steps in the same river twice. There aren't two snowflakes are never the same, is accommodated by this probabilistic perspective on these pullback attractors, and that's effectively the root or the basis of the move that gives rise to this Bayesian mechanics. Because once you've got in mind a description of the system in terms of the probability density of the system being in any state, you can now just appeal to all of physics to describe the evolution, not of the state in state space, but of the probability distribution. And this boils down to something really very simple and really interesting, because we've just said that there is effectively a pullback attractor. We could also describe this as a non-equilibrium steady state. It's non-equilibrium because we're talking about open systems. But there is a steady state in the sense that this repeating, this replication, this itinerant revisiting of neighborhoods means that the density, the probability density reading of this object is itself unchanging. So I can just go along and take off the shelf your favorite density dynamics. This could be Richard Feynman's pathological formulation. It could be a master equation in kinetic models. It could be the Fokker-Planck equation. Whatever you like. They're all, at this level, expressions of the same thing. They just basically express the rate of change of this probability density in terms of the amplitude gamma of random fluctuations and the flow through state space at any point in that state space. So I've just written that down in terms of the Fokker-Planck equation. But note, because we want to describe things that possess this attracting set or have a non-equilibrium steady state solution, the rate of change of this probability distribution is zero, which means I can now solve the density dynamics. Perhaps I should just say that this is also one expression of a time-independent Schrodinger equation. So I can just get the solution to that. And that allows me to do something quite interesting. It allows me to express the dynamics, the flow of the states as a function of where I am in state space, as a mixture of gradient flows on the gradients subtended by the log of this probability, basically a potential, a Lagrangian. In my world, we would call this self-information, which is nice because it's all about self-organization. Also called by people like Tribus surprisal, or more simply surprise, or the negative of it is surprisal or surprise and self-information. This partition of these two kinds of flows here is due to or a generalization of the Helmholtz decomposition. And all it's saying is that the flow at any one point on this attracting set, this pullback attractor, this manifold, can be divided into two parts. One is a gradient flow up log probability gradients or down potential gradients, and one which circulates on the iso potential or probability contours. So often called solenoidal flow in virtue of that, or divergence-free flow or conservative flow, whereas this part is the dissipative dynamics of flow, and has curl-free aspects to it. So that circular flow, I think, I sort of highlight that simply because of our discussion previously about the importance of replication, repetition, revisiting the neighborhood of states that we were once in, those states that are characteristic of the kind of thing that I am. This is rests upon the nonlinearities in these systems, these random dynamical systems, that manifests as this solenoidal circular flow. So I think that's quite important, although it wasn't something I was going to foreground in this. You do realize, we're not going to do this in 30 minutes or an hour. So you're going to have to stop me at the designated time.
We'll keep going as long as you can keep going, and then the audience will have questions anyhow. We can always come back for a part 2.
I think we're going to have to come back for a part 2. At this rate, it's going to probably be part 3.
I think we're going to have to come back for a part 3.
Because you're drilling down some of the really key issues, which are speak to the nature of the kind of systems that that we're trying to account for. So not only do we have this this sort of solenoidal aspect and this itinerancy and the randomness that is underwritten by pullback attractors, but also what we implicitly we've spoken about is the fact that these systems exist at multiple scales, and each scale provides a context for the scale below, and they all have this sort of itinerant, non-equilibrium, steady state aspect. But the steady state is never actually attained, but is is slowly going towards these solutions at different time scales. So an important aspect of this construction is that there is a scale above. So we're talking before about this being my heartbeat. That scale is going to be much, much longer and larger than the scale associated with the depolarization of the myocardium or any particular cell in my myocardium that could be responding to inputs and outputs at a much faster time scale, say oscillating very, very fast frequencies much more quickly than the slow second to second evolution of the system at the level of the heart itself. And what that means is that from the point of view of one cell, then the context in which it is operating is largely unchanging, by appeal to an adiabatic approximation, which means that there is a solution at that temporal scale of the single cell to its fast dynamics. So it can attain its particular attracting set at this phase in the cardiac cycle. However, of course, the phase in the cardiac cycle is itself slowly changing. So the pullback attractor from the point of view of a single cell is slowly moving all the time. And of course, exactly the same maths underwrites Darwinian selection. So you've got your phenotype, which is the single cell, from the point of view of evolution or transgenerational dynamics, from the point of view of the phylogenetic time course or time scales, nothing. The organism is changing very, very quickly as it grows and behaves and acts and decides and develops and dies. But from the point of view of the phenotype, the change in the genotype is so slow that's irrelevant. So the phenotype, the creature, the organism at a very small scale, now can be described as if it is conforming to its own little pullback attractor, the states that I described before about getting up and doing my emails and having my cup of coffee. That's only true while I am alive, or while I am in a position to read emails and drink my cup of coffee. So that attractor, that manifold, has if you like, an expiry date on it. But because of the adiabatic approximation, we can assume that at any given scale, the scale above is changing so slowly that we can assume the existence of the solution to these dynamics, and therefore apply the solution of the Fokker-Planck equation. So I'm witching on about that because I think there's a beautiful connection with Darwinian thinking here. Once you put this density dynamics of the kind that you would, pursue in terms of quantum mechanics, if you read this as a Schrodinger equation. You can pursue this, and what you end up with is a variational or a density dynamic approach to natural selection in and of itself. And lots of people have written about this, and it's certainly a current theme, as far as I know, in theoretical biology, reading things like, say, the replicator equation as effectively exactly the same mechanics that people doing inference and Bayesian filtering would use. So there's an opportunity here to have a completely distinct lecture, just talking about the mathematical and formal correspondences between the story I was going to tell about Bayesian mechanics and the story that somebody taking a Bayesian perspective on Darwinian dynamics would tell. It's the same story, basically. But anyways, in order to tell that story, I have to make a link now between this sort of universal dynamics expressed in terms of a Helmholtz decomposition, which we can read as an admixture of gradient flows, up log probability gradients, up adaptive fitness or marginal likelihood, if you like, and this circular replicator-like dynamics that is associated with the conservative or the divergence-free flow or dynamics. How does that read as inference and Bayesian filtering or sentient behavior? Well, that's where the Markov blanket comes in. So if we now go back and just remember that previously we'd just been talking about any arbitrary and exceedingly large state space, X. Now we're going to partition X into the external, internal, and intervening blanket states. And furthermore, just focus on two of those subsets, namely the internal states of any given system, say me, and my active states. And then by construction, if you remember, the unique thing about the internal states and the external states is that they are not influenced by the external states. However, that Helmholtz decomposition still has to be present, which means that I can write down the dynamics of my internal states, say, or my neuronal dynamics, and my motion of my actuators, my active states, my muscles or autonomic reflexes, as in terms of this Helmholtz decomposition, where the gradients are supplied by exactly the same potential. So the log of the probability of some sensory sector of my Markov blanket given that particular Markov blanket partition. The reading of this, and it is just an interpretation, is in terms of perception and action respectively, and the perception part now yields to an interpretation in terms of sense making and Bayesian inference, which is why I was talking about the emergence of Bayesian mechanics from the master equation or the time-independent Schrodinger equation or the Fokker-Planck equation, if you're given the Markov blanket partition. In other words, if something exists in the sense that it possesses this distinguishing aspect in terms of possessing a Markov blanket, then it must comply with this its internal and active states, sometimes referred to as autonomous states of this particle or person, must conform to this dynamics here. So now the game is, how would one interpret this? How will you describe this to your students or your professors or your children? And there are lots of ways that you can do that. So I've just listed a few here. I'm sure you will have come across all of these. But just to, again, reinforce this point that this is foundational in the sense that it is assumed or described by many theories of self-organization and in particular accounts of behavior, things that actually move. So what is this quantity? Log probability of my sensory states given a Markov blanket. Well, we've just said that these states belong to an attracting set, the pullback attractor. So these are the sensory states that are attractive to me in the sense that they score those kinds of states I expect myself to be in. If I was Darwinian or Darwin, I would say that these are the adaptive states. They are the states that I repeat are characteristic of me as a surviving phenotype, given I've got this pullback attractor and it is permitted by the context in which, or the universe in which this attractor is manifest. So it just scores the attractiveness or the value to me of being in this particular sensory state here, or the value in this sensory state space. So all this equation is saying is that both perception and action is going to try and maximize value, and that can now be read as reinforcement learning. If I was an engineer, it would be called optimal control theory. And if I was an economist, it would just be expected utility theory, where the reward, the control objective, or the utility just is this log probability of being in a state that is characteristic of the kind of state that I find myself in. The negative of this thing is what I was referring to before, which is the self-information, also known as surprisal or surprise. So this equation says that or it looks as if I am trying to minimize my surprise or self-information. And from that, we can read off the principle of maximum mutual information, or the Informax principle, equivalent to the minimal redundancy principle of Horace Barlow, and the free energy principle. So where does the free energy principle get into the game? Well, the variational free energy is a proxy for, in fact, it's actually an upper bound on the self-information. So when people talk about the free energy principle as systems trying to minimize their free energy, what they mean is basically systems that conform to this foundational Helmholtz decomposition of their dynamics, where you've just substituted the free energy for the Lagrangian, the potential self-information, or the surprisal.
Just a moment. Sorry, Professor, you keep saying, well, before we explain this to our children, some non-trivial task, to put it lightly, you keep saying given a Markov blanket. Now, what's giving us the Markov blanket? Is it the causal structure of the universe?
Yeah.
Is it our internal versus active states? Or does the Markov blanket give rise to those instead? And I understand there's some interplay. I understand that. But what gives us initially the Markov blanket?
Right. Well, I think you're now touching upon the tautology that I introduced right at the beginning. So when I say given, I just mean technically conditioned upon. So that bar in the notation in my world, it just means given or conditioned upon something. So more explicitly, everything I am saying depends upon the existence of a Markov blanket. So, but your question, I think, is slightly deeper than that. So the question I heard was, does the Markov blanket emerge from this kind of dynamics, or does this kind of dynamics, or these kinds of, this kind of dynamics create a Markov blanket? The answer is very clear. All we are doing is describing the dynamics of any system that possesses a Markov blanket. So this is a little bit like, it's deflation in the following sense. So what the free energy principle is saying is not that in order to survive, you must maximize value or adaptive fitness or marginal likelihood. That's not what the free energy principle is saying. What it's saying is, if you survive in the sense of possessing a pullback attractor, then you will always be described as if you are maximizing value, adaptive fitness, or marginal likelihood. So that is the tautology that I was appealing to in the Darwinian sense. So we're assuming all we're doing is trying to evince a physics. Basically, what this ends up being is a variational principle of least action that can be applied to something, where the thing in question is very carefully defined technically in terms of a Markov blanket. So by saying that something exists, then the free energy principle applies simply because the thingness is defined stipulatively by being able to differentiate the time average of this self-information is entropy, which means that these equations can also be read as the holy grail of self-organization in the sense that they look as if, on average, they're trying to minimize entropy. And then from that, you can elaborate synergetics of the kind that Hermann Haken has established. And if I was a physiologist, it's just an expression of homeostasis. It's just keeping your essential variables, your physiological variables, within viable bounds that are valuable for me, that are characteristic of my particular states. So resisting the dispersion of the random fluctuations by these gradient flows that look as if I'm trying to minimize self-information, or on average, trying to minimize the entropy of my sensory states. And there's a final interpretation which licenses the rhetoric of Bayesian mechanics. So if I was a statistician, what I would describe this quantity as is just the probability of some sensory data given, conditioned upon my Markov blanket, that I can now read as a model. So my blanket and my internal states now can be read as a model of the external states. So I can now equivalently describe this Helmholtz decomposition of the dynamics in terms of the Bayesian brain hypothesis or evidence accumulation, and a popular one in the neurosciences and the cognitive sciences is predictive coding. So this has been taken even further in philosophy, that you can read these equations as essentially doing a gradient descent on model evidence. Model evidence is also known as a marginal likelihood. Why marginal? Well, because you've marginalized out all the causes of your sensory states or your sensory data, your sensory impressions, the impressions of on the sensory sector of your Markov blanket, by which I mean those causes that are the external states are not part of this probability density. So you've effectively integrated out or averaged away or marginalized them. So this is also known as the marginal likelihood or the model evidence. The likelihood of these data given me as a model of the world, the external states that caused these data. And that has been described or summarized in philosophy as self-evidencing. So I'm minimizing my self-information just is acting and perceiving in a way where perceiving is associated with my internal dynamics in a way that maximizes the evidence for my model of the world or the external states. Put that another way, this self-evidencing just means that it looks as if I'm going around gathering evidence for my model of the world that just is me. So I'm just gathering evidence for the fact that I exist. So that's the most deflationary but poetic reading of this Bayesian mechanics. So that gives you just a flavor of the different ways in which you can understand ways of describing the dynamics of things, where the thing in virtue of its existence cannot have any other dynamics. And that can be sort of neatly summarized in terms of the existence of a particle implies a partition of the system's states, the systemic states, into internal blanket comprising sensory and active, and external states that are hidden behind the Markov blanket from the point of view of the internal states. And because the active states change, but are not changed by the external states, they look as if they're going to reduce the entropy of the blanket states. And this means that action will appear to maintain the structural and functional integrity of the Markov blanket. And one can read this in terms of self-assembly in computational chemistry or in biology as self-creation or autopoiesis of a very elemental form. And finally, internal states appear to infer the hidden causes of sensory states by increasing Bayesian evidence or model evidence or marginal likelihood, and actively influence those causes. And in my world, we refer to this as active inference, taking this self-evidencing perspective afforded by the interpretation of the underlying self-information as effectively the log of the negative log of Bayesian model evidence. So that was the first half of the talk. I now notice that we're being well over our allotted time. I'm going to suggest that we stop here, and then you can wax lyrical and ask questions for a few minutes, and then we should rebook part 2 to tell the same story, but now just using the concepts and the rhetoric and the constructs from neurobiology and psychology.
Okay, so then this is actually a natural stopping point, because the latter half of the talk is using the first half of the talk to explain neurobiology and psychology.
Absolutely. Yeah, we're just going to basically interpret the same gradient flow Helmholtz decomposition, but through the lens of somebody looking at electrophysiology and sense making in animals, and indeed psychology or possibly even neurophilosophy. Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so one of my questions was this Fokker-Planck equation. I'm unsure what you're saying is the relationship between that and other density equations, like in quantum mechanics, Schrodinger's equation or the Feynman path integral. Are you saying that you can derive the Feynman path integral from the Fokker-Planck equation, or that the Fokker-Planck equation is a density equation of the same sort that follows the calculus of variations? Like, is that what unites them?
Yeah.
Just that there's minimizing something or maximizing something?
Well, I think the latter expression, there's just ways of articulating the same thing. So you can either write down the dynamics in terms of a random dynamical system, in terms of, say, a Langevin equation, specify the equations of motion in terms of these flows and the statistics of random fluctuations, and then it is a fairly trivial matter to move to either a Fokker-Planck description of the implicit density, probability densities of this random dynamical system that can be articulated either in terms of a path integral formulation or in terms of a Fokker-Planck equation.
Okay, so then is the claim that the Langevin equation is the ultimate equation that gives rise to the other equations? I think in terms of what is the seed that gives birth to the rest?
I think, well, for me, I mean, you if you spoke to other people, you may get a different answer. But certainly for me, the seed is the Langevin equation. It is just a description of a random dynamical system. It's random because you've got these random fluctuations that, in my world, distinguish themselves from movements in state space in virtue of just being very, very, very fast. So fast that they cannot be observed. So you can't actually observe them. All you can do is write down a probability distribution, say the mean and variance. So for me, it would start here. Given that, I can then write down the Fokker-Planck equation. Specifically, the amplitude, the statistics, the sufficient statistics of the random fluctuations just are the gamma here, and I know F. So if I know the statistics of the random fluctuations and the flow, then I then I can now just articulate this in terms of the Fokker-Planck equation that is just a function of the statistics of the random fluctuations and the flow, and from that you could express it in terms of a pathological formulation. So that that is the seed, and then we move to the Fokker-Planck equation, and then make a very, very simple and important move. The move is that this is equal to 0, because the things that we want to understand possess a solution to the Fokker-Planck equation. That they have a solution to the density dynamics in the same way that the time-independent Schrodinger equation, which would be the equivalent if you were working. Well, perhaps I can just show you what I meant by that, which would be the equivalent in quantum mechanics. You're just looking at the solutions with a little preview of what we might have the opportunity to go through in sessions 2 and 3. But what I wanted to show you, this is just another intuition as to the importance of this Helmholtz decomposition in terms of self-organizing systems countering the random this dispersion due to random fluctuations by imagining somebody dropping a blob of ink into a cup, and the ink molecules gathering themselves up by flowing up the concentration gradients. But you also have this sort of solenoidal component, very much like we are all aware of when we're looking at sort of water flowing down the bath the bath hole, but also doing its solenoidal thing. But what I wanted to just illustrate, so the Fokker-Planck, there are the special cases of this, the solution to the Fokker-Planck equation that obtain when the amplitude of the random fluctuations goes away, and you're just left with a solenoidal flow, and that's just classical mechanics. So that's just things where there are lawful relationships between position and velocity and mass and the like that emerge just because of this circular solenoidal conservative dynamics. Or the random fluctuations can get so big when you get very, very small because you're under the renormalization group, or your random fluctuations haven't yet been averaged away because you're too small. And then you get sort of thermodynamics, where it's all about the gradient flow, and from that you can derive fluctuation dissipation theorems and statistical loss, specifically stochastic mechanics. If you wanted to go quantum, you just factorize this probability density in terms of complex roots, and you get from this the Schrodinger time-independent Schrodinger equation.
Who was the first to point this out? See these 3 different colors that you have here, the 3 different derivations. Who was the first to point out that they're all
the same reflections
under different assumptions? 4, actually, that they're all under the Langevin equation, which is then decomposed in various ways.
My training, just to qualify, this is the Bayesian mechanics that is exactly the same as these things. But you've just now split your X's into internal and active states, and so I've shown the 4th one because the Bayesian mechanics is just the same as that. I don't know. The last time I was sitting in a lecture theatre doing physics was at the Cavendish Laboratory at Cambridge, so 40 years ago.
So you've at least independently stated this.
Oh, well, yeah, but I'm assuming it's common knowledge. Certainly.
Okay.
I mean, you'll know better than I will. Certainly, the equivalence between the pathological formulation and the Fokker-Planck equation, and the time-independent Schrodinger equation. Well, I don't say common knowledge. I have certainly referred people to technical papers in the literature just to substantiate the observation that one can derive everything from the Langevin equation.
Sorry, sir. To maximize on the time, as this is a pun, actually, at the time that we have left, I want to talk about maximization or minimization. You said that, let's take Darwin as an example. Survival of the fittest sounds like if you're the fittest, you will survive.
Yep.
But then you said, well, if you were to survive, it would appear as if you were the fittest, and those two aren't the same statements. And rather, what's happening is the latter.
Absolutely,
So
yeah.
help me understand how those two sentences are different.
I think they're only different in the sense that the notion that I survive because I have a high adaptive fitness um, implies a teleology. So you can have a completely teleologically or telonomy or teleology free account of self-organization under the free energy principle, and also quantum mechanics and um, um, stochastic and classical mechanics.
Okay, so you weren't saying that. Let's say we take this cup, and if I was to let go, it would just fall, and it would fall because it's minimizing action. Now, for people who are listening who don't understand what action is, let's say it's minimizing energy. We don't need to concern ourselves with the difference between two different types of energy being action. It's minimizing something, whether it's energy or action. So that's one way of saying it, that this cup minimizes its action. But then another way of, from what I understood of what you were saying, is that I will only perceive objects that minimize their action. In other words, this cup could have done plenty of other actions, or there could be many other cups, but my perceptual system, for whatever reason, is only tuned to what minimizes. And therefore, it's not that what survives is the fittest, it's only that I'll see what's maximizing the fitness as surviving. Or I'll only see this cup move in this direction because it minimized something.
I think that's absolutely correct, but I think sort of makes it
Okay,
more.
so that sounds loony to me.
Right.
So explain to me how that's
Yeah.
correct.
Now, what I'm saying, the, the things out there conform to a path of least action because they exist. And and therefore we will perceive them as pursuing paths of least action. So that's all the free energy principle is saying. It's just saying that we pursue paths of least action. And what could one apply that to? Well, adaptive fitness, for example. So, Darwinian thinking. What adaptive fitness is just the thing that supplies the potential in the action, which is time times potential. So you're maximizing the adaptive fitness, or you're minimizing the negative adaptive fitness. The nice point of contact that comes into the way you perceive the cup, though, I think reflects the fact that when you put the Markov blanket in place, so don't forget about doing that. You can't talk sensibly about about perceiving apples unless you've got an observer and something that's being observed. So you've immediately invoked a Markov blanket. So if you're talking to Stephen Wolfram, he'd call this the observer problem. To solve the observer problem, to even talk about it, you've got to have a Markov blanket. So there has to be a distinction between the observer and the observee. The measurement problem, the same thing in quantum physics, quantum mechanics. You have to have the Markov blanket explicitly in play. So once you've got the Markov blanket in play, then the adaptive fitness is just the measure of synchrony or isomorphism between the inside and the outside. So literally, if you take this Bayesian mechanics perspective, the adaptive fitness is the ability of you to fit into your environment, by which I mean the sensory impressions provided by your environment, the feedback that the environment is giving you, was the most likely for the kind of thing that you are, the phenotype that you are. So adaptive fitness is just the marginal likelihood of the environment providing that sensory, the way that the environment influences you by the sensory states is the measure of adaptive fitness, and it's just the fit of your model, the ability of your model to fit this world. So it all, I think, it does actually come back to you say, I can only perceive falling apples because apples only fall.
Yes.
If I lived in a universe where which did not comply with a principle of least action, which is not impossible, I could live in a very small universe where random fluctuations cause things to depart enormously from paths of least action, and I would still be able to model that. But in this instance, I would be able to perceive random fluctuations of the apple, or itinerant dynamics, which violated, say, conservative dynamics.
So I have one more question. I know you have to get going. If the free energy principle is true by definition, a tautology, then why is there so many papers published on it? There has to be something more to the free energy principle than just being a tautology. So in other words, Kant has analytic truths, but there must be something here that's synthetic. Otherwise, I don't understand how it can be rich if it's not purely analytic.
Well, I never said it was rich.
I know you're not saying it's rich. The fact that we've even spent over an hour on it, and that there's more than one slide, and that there are papers, and that you're the highest cited neuroscientist in the world, implies that it's rich. So help me understand that.
I can. There is an answer, but given I've only now got 3 minutes left, I think that's an excellent place we should start. I'll give you a clue. You can use the free energy principle in the same sense you can use Hamilton's principle of least action to design automobiles, trajectories, physical artifacts that do stuff. You can leverage the free energy principle to write down your pull back a tractor. You can write down the states to which a system should self-organize, and then just solve the free energy flows or the basic mechanics to reproduce self-organization. And in principle, intelligent kind of self-organization. So you can create and simulate self-organization because you know the principles that underwrite the dynamics. So that's a clue, but I can unpack that in more detail the next time.
Let's uncompress it next time. And I see Hamilton's equation as synthetic, not just analytic, but we can talk about the distinction next time, sir.
Okay.
This was so much fun. And it went by like that. Thank you.
It almost does, doesn't it? I love talking to you.
Yes.
So I'll see you hopefully in a few days or weeks, depending upon your itinerary.
Yes.
Okay, brilliant.
Thank you, sir. Firstly, thank you for watching. Thank you for listening. There's now a website, Jaimungal.org, and that has a mailing list. The reason being that large platforms like YouTube, like Patreon, they can disable you for whatever reason, whenever they like. That's just part of the terms of service. Now, a direct mailing list ensures that I have an untrammeled communication with you. Plus, soon I'll be releasing a one-page PDF of my top 10 toes. It's not as Quentin Tarantino as it sounds like. Secondly, if you haven't subscribed or clicked that like button, now is the time to do so. Why? Because each subscribe, each like helps YouTube push this content to more people like yourself. Plus, it helps out Curt directly, aka me. I also found out last year that external links count plenty toward the algorithm, which means that whenever you share on Twitter, say on Facebook, or even on Reddit, etc., it shows YouTube, hey, people are talking about this content outside of YouTube, which in turn greatly aids the distribution on YouTube. Thirdly, there's a remarkably active Discord and subreddit for theories of everything, where people explicate toes, they disagree respectfully about theories, and build as a community our own toe. Links to both are in the description. Fourthly, you should know this podcast is on iTunes, it's on Spotify, it's on all of the audio platforms. All you have to do is type in theories of everything and you'll find it. Personally, I gain from rewatching lectures and podcasts. I also read in the comments that, hey, toe listeners also gain from replaying. So how about instead you re-listen on those platforms like iTunes, Spotify, Google Podcasts, whichever podcast catcher you use. And finally, if you'd like to support more conversations like this, more content like this, then do consider visiting patreon.com/CurtJaimungal and donating with whatever you like. There's also PayPal, there's also crypto, there's also just joining on YouTube. Again, keep in mind, it's support from the sponsors and you that allow me to work on Toe full time. You also get early access to ad-free episodes, whether it's audio or video. It's audio in the case of Patreon, video in the case of YouTube. For instance, this episode that you're listening to right now was released a few days earlier. Every dollar helps far more than you think. Either way, your viewership is generosity enough. Thank you so much.